gaming has reached that beautiful stage, where paying full price can still leave you asking permission to use what you bought. Apparently, the modern customer gets the box, the download, the receipt, the updates, and a front row seat to somebody else owning the off switch. Ubisoft proved the point when the Crew servers shut down on March 31, 2024, leaving the original game inaccessible. EA repeated the lesson when Anthem reached its January 12, 2026 shutdown, because its online-only design had no offline version waiting underneath. Suddenly, the uncomfortable question is not whether another game will die. Instead, the question is, why publishers keep selling games whose survival depends on systems customers cannot control. Forget the conspiracy version, because nobody has proven that publishers secretly scheduled half your library for execution in 2030. Reality is worse, because it does not require a secret plan. Live service systems can support ongoing updates, account management, progression matchmaking, monetization, and centralized operation. Customers usually notice none of that, while everything works. Steam, meanwhile, states that its content and services are licensed rather than sold, which already makes ownership less simple than the word buy suggests. California even passed AB 2426 to require clearer disclosure when digital goods use ownership-style language, while the transaction actually grants a license. Nothing feels unusual while the servers answer. Everything changes when they stop. Consider what you physically control after buying one of these games. Your console belongs to you, your controller belongs to you, and the installed files may sit on your SSD for years. Yet, the Crew demonstrated that local files can become useless when essential remote infrastructure disappears. Likewise, Anthem showed that an online-only commercial game can reach a point where the client survives, but the game itself does not. More importantly, Ubisoft later proved with the Crew 2 that a shutdown does not always have to mean total death. So, why was that kind of end-of-life plan not standard from the beginning? That is the real mystery here, and the answer gets uglier once the business model enters the room. Naturally, this is where I perform the ritual sacrifice demanded by YouTube, so like the video, subscribe and support the channel if you enjoy watching expensive corporate decisions get dragged into daylight. Otherwise, the algorithm may decide that careful criticism has less value than another thumbnail, with 3 arrows, a red circle, and the word insane. Fine, humiliation complete. Now, return to the problem, because the legal wording only explains why ownership feels slippery. Behind every live service shutdown sits a business calculation the customer does not control. Servers cost money, security costs money, support costs money, engineers cost money, licenses can expire, and shrinking player numbers can make continued operation harder to justify. XDefiant made that logic unusually clear when Ubisoft said it had not attracted and retained enough players to support the level of further investment required. Nobody needs a cartoon villain when a spreadsheet can kill the game perfectly well. Start with the architecture, because this is where the anger becomes practical. Traditional single-player software can often keep working after official support ends, because the essential parts remain on hardware you control. Online-dependent software can move essential functions elsewhere, turning authentication, inventories, progression, matchmaking, world states, or account checks into requirements for basic operation. Once a required service disappears, the customer may possess every local file and still possess no functional game. Crucially, that distinction explains why digital distribution itself is not the enemy. Plenty of digital games can run offline for years. Centralized dependency is the issue, because it gives the publisher practical control over continued access. Money then explains why that control eventually matters. Every live game competes for staff infrastructure, moderation, patches, customer service, security work, and development resources. Successful titles can justify those costs for years. Failed titles cannot. Corporate language makes the decision sound clinical, but the consumer result is brutally simple. When the audience stops satisfying the business requirement, the service can stop satisfying the customer. Babylon's Fall made that uncertainty painfully obvious. Square Enix and Platinum Games launched it in March 2022, then ended service in February 2023, leaving the game unplayable less than 1 year after release. Imagine putting expected usable lifespan, 11 months, beside the launch price and watching how many people still race toward checkout. Of course, live service games usually arrive with roadmaps for seasons, cosmetics, raids, events, and monetization rather than guaranteed end-of-life plans. Marketing tells you what might arrive if everything succeeds. Contracts tell you what rights you actually receive. Silence covers what happens if the numbers fail. Here is why the word buy matters so much. People understand a purchase through ordinary experience, money changes hands, the product becomes theirs to keep, and the seller does not later remove its essential function. Digital licensing complicates that expectation, because access rights can be narrower than physical possession suggests. Valve states that Steam content and services are licensed, not sold, while California's AB 2426 requires clearer disclosure when ownership-style language is used for licensed digital goods. Lawmakers did not invent that requirement, because everyone already understood the distinction perfectly. Still, licensing alone is not the whole scandal. Consumer law varies, contracts have limits, and no sensible argument should pretend that one sentence in a user agreement magically settles every dispute. Ordinary buyers often cannot tell, from the normal purchase flow, whether a game is designed to remain independently usable after official support ends. Architecture determines much of that risk before the player clicks purchase. Offline play creates one future. Permanent publisher authentication creates another. Both can sit beside the same bright BUI button. Then comes the industry's reasonable counterargument. Video Games Europe argues that companies need the ability to discontinue online services when continued operation is no longer commercially viable, and it also raises security, player data, safety liability, and development cost concerns around private server requirements. Those concerns are real. Reasonably, nobody expects empty official servers to run forever, for 5 remaining players and one terrifyingly committed bloke called Kevin. Operating a commercial network indefinitely would be absurd. Forcing every developer to retrofit every old architecture overnight could also be expensive or technically unrealistic. However, none of that answers the better question. Why should ending official service automatically require destroying every playable version of the core game? This is where The Crew 2 becomes awkward, for the absolute version of the excuse. After the backlash surrounding the original The Crew, Ubisoft introduced hybrid mode for The Crew 2 in October 2025, allowing the game to be played offline. Multiplayer features, leaderboards, summits, community sharing, and other online systems, naturally, do not survive in the same form. Core driving does. Progress can be copied into an offline save. Some online rewards and connected storefront features remain unavailable. Nevertheless, the important thing happens: the game can still launch when Ubisoft servers are no longer part of the equation. At that point, preservation stops sounding like a demand for immortal corporate infrastructure. Rather, it becomes an end-of-life design question. Developers can separate essential offline functionality from services that genuinely require servers when the architecture allows it. Publishers can communicate those plans before purchase. Storefronts can disclose whether authentication is mandatory, whether private hosting exists, and whether an offline mode is planned. None of that guarantees perfect preservation. All of it gives customers more certainty than a blank space where the product's future should be. Europe's Stop Destroying Video Games initiative shows how many people consider that uncertainty unacceptable. Over 1.29 million verified statements of support reached the European Commission. Brussels responded in June 2026 without creating a universal legal duty, forcing every discontinued game to remain playable. Separately, the Commission pointed toward existing consumer protections and further work around an industry code of conduct for managing game end of life. Our policymakers are therefore circling the same question buyers should have been asking for years. What exactly is a reasonable ending for a product sold to the public? Picture 2030 for a moment. Maybe your favorite live service game still has millions of players. Perhaps another title receives an offline patch or community server support. Conversely, any game that depends entirely on centralized infrastructure, without a stated end-of-life solution, carries a risk you cannot personally remove. No honest person can tell you that half your library will definitely be dead by then. Equally, no publisher can promise that every server-dependent purchase you make today will still function. Such uncertainty is the real scandal, because the customer takes the long-term risk, while the company keeps the practical control. Credit where it is due, Ubisoft deserves recognition for the Crew 2 hybrid mode, because preserving the core game is materially better than posting a farewell message and turning everything off. Technically, the solution is imperfect, because online saves and offline saves are separate, while several multiplayer or connected features disappear. Practically, that is fine. Games do not need every leaderboard, seasonal event, premium shop, and matchmaking queue preserved forever to remain worth playing. Survival matters more than preserving every temporary online feature. Unfortunately, one functioning end-of-life mode makes the wider industry's lack of planning harder to dismiss. If publishers can spend years designing battle passes, premium currencies, account systems, retention loops, seasonal roadmaps, and storefronts, asking what happens at shutdown should not be treated like forbidden mathematics. Perfection is not required. Players need a credible answer before the obituary arrives. Ultimately, this mess fails at the most basic level, because the industry often wants the emotional meaning of ownership, without guaranteeing the durability customers naturally associate with it. Corporations want you to feel like a buyer when the store opens, a service user when the terms apply, and a former customer when the population falls below whatever number keeps the spreadsheet happy. Modern live service economics make that contradiction impossible to ignore. From the company's side, centralized systems can simplify updates, account management, progression, monetization, anti-cheat work, and operation of one connected service. Centralization can therefore offer real practical advantages during the game's active life. Ironically, the same setup can make preservation dependent on the company that eventually has the strongest financial reason to stop maintaining it. Buyers inherit the downside without controlling the final decision. Calling this a secret plan is unnecessary. Describing it as an unbalanced arrangement is enough. Management chooses the architecture, controls the infrastructure, sets the terms, measures profitability, announces the shutdown, and often decides whether anything playable remains afterward. Meanwhile, the customer discovers the practical meaning of those decisions only when something stops working. Consequently, anger belongs at the front of this conversation, because the issue is not merely server technology. It is control over the future of a product people paid for. Ask how ridiculous the same arrangement would sound elsewhere. Envision buying a television that worked until the manufacturer decided its authentication system no longer justified the cost. Suppose an old stereo required corporate approval every time the speakers turned on. Gaming normalized this gradually because online features delivered genuine benefits, while each new dependency seemed harmless during active support. Eventually, enough dependencies can become conditions that decide whether some games remain games at all. Different titles will need different end-of-life solutions, and some enormous online worlds may be extremely difficult to reproduce outside their original infrastructure. Honesty, however, is not difficult. Studios can explain permanent authentication before purchase. Stores can disclose meaningful shutdown risks. Teams can plan offline modes or community hosting where practical. Regulators can demand clearer information without pretending every network game is identical. Most importantly, stick to what can actually be proven. There is no evidence that publishers secretly programmed an industry-wide death date for 2030. Abundant evidence shows that paid games have already become unusable because essential publisher-controlled services ended. The Crew proves it. Anthem confirms it. Babylon's Fall reinforces it. Hybrid mode in The Crew 2 proves something more important. Complete death is not always the only available ending. Possibly your favorite live service game survives another 20 years. Ideally, it receives an offline mode before the final server closes. Alternatively, one morning, the shutdown announcement arrives, and the game you bought suddenly acquires a funeral date. Would you still buy a live service game if the store page had to tell you exactly what happens when support ends? Whichever outcome comes, the customer should not need a corporate earnings forecast to guess whether a purchase has a future. Beneath all the licenses, roadmaps, servers, and carefully polished corporate language, the question remains painfully simple. Who controls the off switch after you have already paid? Anyway, that's all I've got for today.